So first off, a bit about the Sentinel Project and why it is exactly that we're qualified to talk about this topic. Our mission is to actively assist people worldwide, wherever and whenever they're threatened by mass atrocities. We have genocide in the name, which has a pretty narrow definition. We're actually broadening that to mass atrocities more generally. And this involves early warning and prevention work. So basically predicting where it's likely to happen and then taking actions to stop it from happening or mitigate it if it does happen. And in both of those types of activities, we have two kind of very important elements, which is, of course, innovative use of technology and cooperation with the communities that are actually at risk themselves. In terms of our current work, we're monitoring 6 different countries, or situations of concern, SOCs for short, as we call them, ranging from Azerbaijan to Iran to Indonesia, with a couple of others that we'll be announcing publicly soon. And I would be remiss, as the founder of my organization, if I didn't put up some of the logos of media organizations that have been excitingly covering our work lately. One of the most recent projects in terms of technology that we've launched is HateBase, which came out a couple of months ago. This is the world's largest online database of hate speech, essentially. And what this is, at first it might sound kind of like an urban dictionary for racial slurs and ethnic slurs and things like that. And in a way it is. You can go and have a look and learn what any one of thousands of terms mean. But it's also a monitoring tool, because individuals can go and, in addition to submitting terms to the database and helping to build it that way, they can also log sightings. So if somebody has been called a certain thing or heard it used, they can log that in time and space. And at the same time, we have something called the Twitter Hate Bot, which scans Twitter constantly and automatically logs online sightings that way. And we're looking to expand that because this has the potential to be a pretty powerful early warning tool for us once we link it with other forms of data that we gather. Another tool that we've developed in-house is ThreatWiki, which is our situation tracking software. So this is mostly a working tool for our own analysts, although it is open source. Everything we do is open source, so it's out there for other people to adopt if they want. And essentially, it's a tool for people to gather, or for our team to gather data from our various situations of concern, manage that because potentially it gets the data sets get to be quite large, and then we can visualize it and manipulate it in various ways, such as, of course, on a map or on a timeline, and a whole bunch of other things that we're experimenting with. And the idea is for them to use that in order to essentially do forecasting and start to do that prediction part of our mission that I talked about. We also recently did our first bit of field work, so actually going out to one of our situations of concern and being on the ground. A small team of us went to Kenya as election observers about 2 or 3 months ago. And in addition to looking at Kenya in general and the potential for violence related to the presidential election that they had, we also visited a small area in the eastern part of the country called the Tana Delta, where there were a series of ethnic massacres in the second half of last year and early this year. And what we learned talking to local communities that were affected, and security forces and administrators, is that amongst many other factors, misinformation plays a big role there. And so once we identified this driver, the fact that people have ideas about the neighboring ethnic community that oftentimes puts them in a state of fear or anger and therefore motivates them to go and commit preemptive violence against them, if we had a way to sort of recognize new types of misinformation, rumors, whether it's sort of natural or deliberate, as they're arising, we could actually counter that. So we're looking at going back and having a longer-term involvement, setting up an SMS or text messaging-based system to get submissions from the population, recognize when misinformation is arising, and then actually test messaging to counter that and theoretically reduce the risk of violence. And another area that we're really interested in, and it's one of my favorite pet topics, is unmanned aerial vehicles, or UAVs, commonly known as drones as well. This is something that people tend to know from the news for its arguably negative uses by militaries, especially the US government in the so-called war on terror. But Flying robots, it turns out, have a lot of humanitarian purposes as well. And the vast majority of UAVs in the world today are actually unarmed and flying generally for civilian purposes. So we see them being adopted now for disaster response, conservation work by ecologists, as well as in several places in Africa and Asia being used for anti-poaching patrols to actually protect endangered species. One area where there's very limited adoption so far is in the human rights realm. So we're actually exploring what can be done here with UAVs for human rights and specifically in our case, atrocity prevention purposes. So that's enough about the Sentinel Project. I'm not here to advertise our organization, although I do like talking about it. But to move on with our our main topic for tonight, why is technology relevant to human rights? There are basically two reasons for this, two very broad reasons. The new availability of technology in the time that we live in, and when I say technology, that's a very broad category. We'll look at some specific examples later on. But the time that we live in presents sort of unprecedented opportunities and risks in terms of the tools that are available and well, as I said, the opportunities and risks that they create. And those work both ways, both for human rights defenders and for human rights violators. So as much as human rights defenders are able to use new tools like social media, sort of the ever-growing presence of mobile phones, etc., to mobilize populations to document abuses and so on, violators are often able to use the same technologies or other technologies in order to violate rights at the same time. When you think about social media, oftentimes that's a great platform for certain governments to spread propaganda or to engage in censorship or to commit surveillance against their populations and violate their citizens' privacy. So this is something we'll look at in a little bit more detail, but it's really important to understand that sort of duality between the opportunities and the risks that are here and how they apply to different people in the sort of human rights game. So what do activists need to know when they're adopting technology into their campaigns? And this applies, as I said earlier, outside of human rights to other types of social change type campaigns as well. So we have to be able to know how to use tools in order to achieve our goals, adapt existing tools in new ways, because a lot of what's been done is not necessarily about inventing something new, but it's about creative adaptation of an existing tool, as well as recognizing those vulnerabilities that I mentioned. This is really key, one of the principles that we'll cover, being able to understand when the dangers really outweigh the benefits of using a particular tool, and then understanding how technologies can be used against us and mitigate those as well. And the 1090 rule, which is noted at the bottom of the slide there, is something really important that really sums up a lot of really encapsulates everything that we're going to be talking about here and that we talk about in our course. And that basically states that in any given campaign that you're engaging in, the technology, the tools themselves are really only 10% of the solution, and the other 90% is about people and behavioral aspects and social aspects and how people are going to use those tools. And I'll get into a bit more detail later on, but in a lot of cases people have forgotten that, and so certain campaigns have failed because somebody set up a very effective, very nice, fancy new tool of some sort and forgot to really tell anybody about it or consider a lot of the other aspects. So ultimately, when we're talking about technology, what we're really talking about is information and communication. Everything here, regardless of what it is, whether it's something like our own projects, like I mentioned, like hate base, or UAVs, or somebody organizing a demonstration using social media, really what they're doing is working with information, whether that's gathering it, storing it, analyzing it, transmitting it, etc. And that applies whether it's an individual talking to another individual or an individual talking to many other individuals. And that's why we have different types of interaction. You know, the one-to-many, which is the sort of traditional use of technology in the past. Think of traditional media like radio and television, where the barrier to entry and to using those tools was very high because it required a lot of money and resources. So really only governments and large corporations could actually engage in the communication, and it was one way. as where today we have many to one, the ability to actually gather information from members of the population using tools like mobile phones, for instance, for crowdsourcing during certain situations. There's also obviously one-to-one, just two people communicating amongst them between each other. And then there's the idea of many-to-many, which now that we live in a time when that barrier to entry in terms of using technology is so low that anybody can have a blog, that anybody can have a website or a Twitter feed, or start forwarding messages to all their phone contacts via SMS and that sort of thing. Anybody can become really a broadcaster. And once you have a whole bunch of people and all of the recipients also being broadcasters, you end up with something that looks less like a fan in terms of the flow of information and more like a web. And things become very complex then. So what, in concrete terms, what can technology actually be used to do? It can mobilize populations, document abuses, maintain freedom of speech, help to understand crises, and various other things. There's really no limit to what can be done here, except, the only limit really is the creativity and the imagination of the people that are actually doing the work. And I'll show some examples, and I'm sure there are even better ones out there because this is a really rapidly changing field, but examples of some very impressive things that people have done with some very basic technologies in order to effect change. Now, it's important to understand that when we talk about technology, we're not talking about necessarily a brand new thing. Technology, like I said earlier, is a very broad category. So yes, it does include modern things like mobile phones, social media, blogs, etc. But it also includes, even today, but in past times as well, things like photocopiers and faxes and printing presses, which have played, as the technologies of their day, very important means. And so it's not like people only just started organizing themselves for social change within the last 2 decades when they had the ability to fax each other or phone each other or anything like that. These are all things that have been happening for a long time. And so it's important to understand that while the tools change, a lot of the objectives don't. So people have been, people have been organizing demonstrations, people have been sort of standing up for their rights, people have been agitating for liberation and that sort of thing for centuries, and they always were opportunistic in using the tools of the day. So have a look at some historical examples of technology being used in this way. The French resistance movement during the Second World War made, and as did others, they made extensive use of underground printing presses in order to circulate newspapers, which sort of countered German propaganda and that sort of thing, while of course creating their own propaganda in order to shore up civilian support for the movement. And they also made great use of wireless transmission, so basically underground radio. Around the same time period, the Quit India movement of 1942, one of several Indian independence movements under British rule, made use of something called Congress Radio, which was an underground radio station that operated for about 3 months after there had been a severe crackdown by the authorities on the leadership of the movement. And so their idea at the time was to use Congress Radio as a way to maintain cohesion amongst the population, to counter government propaganda, and essentially to maintain what was called a leaderless movement, because all the leaders were in prison and all that were left were a few people hiding out in an attic somewhere with a radio station. Eventually they too unfortunately were captured, and so Congress Radio shut down. But that, at that time, the ability to broadcast a message out to a population without having access to government-controlled infrastructure was sort of a creative use of the ICT, the information communication technology of the time. And our final sort of historical example is the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia in 1989. So right at the end of the Cold War, a lot of people in places like Czechoslovakia living under communist rule didn't have access to information about what was happening, essentially, about the truth about what was happening in different parts of their country, let alone what was happening in the rest of the world, because the government was very keen on censoring a lot of publications and that sort of thing, and even controlled the means of producing paper documents. At that time, things like printing presses were banned from private ownership. Even things now that seem incredibly archaic to us, like typewriters, were controlled items. If you had a typewriter, which you probably wouldn't, but if you did, or any government typewriters, had to be registered at the local KGB office because they were considered such dangerous tools because they gave private citizens the ability to mass produce information and spread their own message to other people. So that's why it was a big deal when people started smuggling in or producing their own underground printing presses and using that to create samizdat, or underground publications that distributed censored information, countered the regime propaganda, etc. And eventually, this contributed to getting large numbers of people out into the streets. So it was linked with real-world action and getting them to protest and fortunately, eventually, peacefully bring down the government. Now it is, there are debates about the effectiveness of samizdat, as there are with the effectiveness of any technology and any information campaign in any place. And that's why we have this sort of back and forth between people that can be called cyber utopians. On the one hand, those who think that technology is a silver bullet, it's a panacea that will solve all problems. If you just give people internet access, then next thing that they'll have is democracy and freedom and human rights. Without any other, sort of reason. It's step one is internet, and step two is happiness and utopia. And on the other hand, there are the cyber skeptics who feel like this is all a whole bunch of hype, and say no, there's not really any value to technological tools for promoting democracy or promoting human rights and so on. All of that could happen in the absence of these things. So who's right? The truth, I would argue, is somewhere in the middle. After all, like I said earlier, these things have been happening. People have been standing up for their rights long before Twitter. People have been organizing protests long before Facebook and that sort of thing. But on the other hand, without being linked to real-world action and just being used as a means to an end, these types of tools don't necessarily bring about change of their own accord. So there's a video which I, of course, don't have time to show, but I recommend you go check it out. It's by a guy named Evgeny Morozov, called How the Internet Strengthens Dictatorships. And he's kind of in the middle here, slightly more to the skeptical side. And he's one of the leading, at least when it comes specifically to the internet and human rights and democracy, he's one of the leading kind of thinkers on that. So I recommend checking him out.
Can you say it again? Check what?
Pardon me?
Can you say it again? Check what?
Oh, it's called How the Internet Strengthens Dictatorships.
Oh.
There's also, not produced by him, but just a side note, kind of a tangent. There's a document on the internet somebody produced called The Dictator's Practical Guide to, The Dictator's Internet Guide to Power Retention. And it's actually really good. Like if you've got an hour or two to read it, it completely sums up everything that there is to say about the internet and why it's sort of a double-edged sword when it comes to things like opposing authoritarianism and promoting democracy. And you can read the sort of the activist version, which is written in how to use the internet way for positive ends, and then you can read the dictator version, which is written in the perspective of the dictator, and it's like a how-to manual for you if you were a dictator. So it can be amusing, but also very informative. Continuing on the sort of debate angle, there's at least one of these guys I wouldn't be surprised if you've heard of, Malcolm Gladwell, and another guy named Clay Shirky, who kind of represent the opposite ends of that cyber utopian versus cyber skeptic debate that I mentioned. With Gladwell being more to the skeptic side, bringing up the example here of the Save Darfur Coalition Facebook page, which at the time of his speaking had 1.3 million members who had on average donated 9 cents each to humanitarian aid in Darfur. Clearly an example of what he would call a failure, and I would tend to agree. And on the other side, you have Clay Shirky, who is a very adamant supporter of the idea that social change in some cases could not take place without social media. And he brings up examples such as the 2001 impeachment of the Philippine government, the beef protests in South Korea in 2008, and the communist defeat in Moldova in 2009. And so you might wonder, here, who is right? Is the answer, once again, that it depends, or the correct answer is in the middle? I would say that they're both right in different ways, because they're actually talking about different things when you think about it. Now, I'm willing to bet that all of the people who are, or 99.9% of the people who are engaged in the different campaigns that Clay Shirky is talking about, lived in the Philippines. They lived in South Korea. They lived in Moldova. And that means that their online activism and their online engagement could much more easily be transferred or transformed into real-world action. So they could be engaged online and then be prompted to take some kind of real-world action because they lived within the context or the social context that they were trying to change. On the other hand, I'm willing to bet that 99.9% of the people who were members of the Save Darfur Coalition Facebook page didn't live in Darfur, or probably even Sudan, or probably even Africa, and probably a good number of them didn't even know where Darfur was. So what exactly were they going to do? Probably a lot of these people fell into the category of what we might call slacktivists, where they feel that retweeting or liking something is their great contribution to a particular cause, and never really go anywhere past that. So really, essentially, we're talking about different things here based on where the location of the individuals who are being engaged was. So obviously, social media and liberation technologies, which is a term that gets applied here sort of broadly sometimes, obviously these tools can have a valuable impact if they're used correctly. They can connect oppressed populations, connect them with the outside world as well as with themselves, so that people can discuss issues that they might not have a forum for otherwise within their country. It can also help to decentralize leadership structures for an opposition movement, let's say, as we saw in the Quit India example. And of course, there's the ability to alert the outside world, the so-called awareness raising that people often like to talk about, but which does have value in some cases. And they can help to push for actual social change. However, social media can't by itself topple a government. It can't reliably protect people from actual danger or physical harm. And it definitely does not replace real-world action, which is something that I'm going to come back to quite a bit. That's a point that I'll harp on a lot, is to not be a slacktivist, but to be an actual activist who is using tools to support real-world action, but not in place of them. No number of tweets and no number of likes of a Facebook page, no number of forwarded SMS messages are going to overthrow a dictatorial regime or stop a genocide or help to improve workers' rights somewhere or something like that. It always has to be linked to real-world action, which is a point that is often missed. So this is a little harsh, but this image is something I found kind of amusing. It might be a little hard to see on the screen there, but basically there's a screenshot of a Facebook page which has terrible spelling that it says, "Like this if you're against thirsty people." And so somebody sees it and clicks like, and they imagine their like is flying through cyberspace and somehow magically transforms into water, which on the other side of the world comes out of a faucet into the hands of thirsty people who drink it and are no longer thirsty. And it's a really happy story. Unfortunately, what it reflects is not anywhere near reality. So that's just kind of somewhat amusing representation of this slacktivism mentality, which a lot of people who aren't directly engaged in some form of activism or work for social change don't necessarily always catch. Now, that doesn't mean that you should go out and abandon social media and whatever technologies you're using. I know I always get excited when I see the number of likes on the Facebook page for the Sentinel Project go up and that sort of thing. But you have to wonder, why is that exciting? For me, it's because we've added more people to our online community, which we can then engage in other ways in the future, whether it's getting them to volunteer or to help with spread the word about initiatives that we have going on or to donate. It helps us to build potential for some kind of other concrete action. So people need to keep using these technologies, but understand what they can and cannot do and make sure that they're using them correctly. It has to kind of make sense for the given campaign or the given organization. So in order to achieve that, there are some fundamental principles that we need to keep in mind. And we have 12 of these. I don't cover all of them here. We cover all 12 in the full course, but we have 6, which I'll run through with some quick explanation. So number 1 is to always consider your audience. Think about what technologies they actually use, because of course people living in very different parts of the world in very different situations have access to different technologies. Fortunately, mobile phones and the internet and that sort of thing are becoming incredibly and increasingly more available, but they're still not entirely universal yet. So that being said, people do usually have access to some form of communications medium. Even if you're talking about a very impoverished rural area in sub-Saharan Africa where radio, something that people here in North America might consider to be a fairly primitive technology, is still the primary way that people get information about the world around them and the wider world outside of their own country. So you also have to think about how much people trust those, because there's a graphic that I don't have up here, but speaking of the radio example, there have been surveys done showing that people in different places have different levels of trust in different technologies, also depending on what's being reported on it. So somebody living, like I said, in an impoverished area of, let's say, Botswana might place a lot more trust in radio than they do in national television, perhaps, or international television for getting certain types of information. Similarly, some of those might not even be accessible to them. Think about that. What is the reason that the majority of people in the types of places that I mentioned are more trusting of radio? Part of the reason is just that they're more able to access it, because these are areas that are not only impoverished, and so therefore people are not going to own televisions and smartphones and computers, but they're also areas where illiteracy is very high. So even printed material like newspapers are not accessible. So that's not even, I mean, that's very broad, having a very broad definition of what counts as, information communication technology to include newspapers. But in that case, we're talking about something very basic that's actually inaccessible for people. So number 2, behavior is more important than tools, just kind of revisiting the 1090 rule that I mentioned earlier, where you might have the technology, but you also have to have a strategy surrounding how you're going to employ that technology. Think about how it's going to be used, how you're going to make sure that people know about it, and know what it can and cannot do for them. You don't want people having misconceptions about a certain tool that you might be setting up, a certain platform. You almost have to think of it like marketing in a way. You have a product which can be used to achieve objective X, and you need to make sure that your potential customers or clients know that it exists and what it can do for them, what it can't do for them, so they don't have unrealistic expectations, etc. And an example of this, which I'll talk about a bit more later on, is the crisis mapping platform Ushahidi, where it was created about 5 years ago in Kenya. It essentially allows people to submit information via text message, email, web forms, social media, etc., which is then applied to a map to help to visualize a situation. And it's found really widespread adoption. But one statistic that I was told by a guy who studied it is that out of the 20,000 times that Ushahidi has been deployed in different situations, there are only a few dozen that he would consider to really be runaway successes. There were a lot of other cases where people did the 10% really well. They set up their instance of Ushahidi and said, here it is, we have a map on a website, that's great. And then they forgot to tell anybody about it. So very few, if any, people actually went and started submitting data, which kind of kills the whole point of having a crowdsourced map. Oh, and I should point out, there is relevance to this picture that's here actually. An example of an organization that does a good job of this is called Sisi Nyamani in Kenya. Their name means we are peace in Swahili. And what they do essentially is try to spot areas that are at risk of violence and then reduce that risk by broadcasting pro-peace, kind of peace-building messages out to the population via SMS. Now, they didn't just start doing this one day. They actually got a bunch of volunteers and sent them out wearing their blue Sisi Nyamani t-shirts into the community to just show people in person what CCNA was, how it worked, what it could do for them, and what to expect from it. You have to also assess and manage your risks because, like I said earlier, for every opportunity that comes along with a tool, there are also risks, there are dangers. And sometimes those dangers will outweigh the benefits of using a particular tool in a particular instance. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to be a security expert yourself. I'm definitely not, but there are people out there that you can draw upon. Just knowing that you need to ask about the vulnerabilities of a particular tool and find somebody who can help you to figure out what they are and mitigate those puts you well ahead of the game, because you don't want to end up like this guy here, whose name is Austin Heap, who in 2009 saw what was happening in Iran with the Green Revolution, the pro-democracy protests that were sort of experiencing a very brutal crackdown, and he created something called Haystack, which was a piece of software intended to help Iranians communicate amongst themselves and with the outside world in a secure, confidential manner. Because at that time, the Western media and Western governments were so excited about what was happening in Iran, and they were so excited about technology, a lot of people had dubbed this the Twitter revolution. The US State Department, which had applied sanctions to Iran, making it very difficult and illegal to export software there, they expedited a permit for Haystack to be exported to Iran. Now, nobody in the State Department did their due diligence and put this through any sort of tests, and it came out sometime later that Haystack was actually completely riddled with security holes, so that the people who were using it, thinking that they were protected, were actually at greater risk than if they had not been using it at all, or if they had been using a different tool. Fortunately, it didn't get really great adoption in the first place, so it looks like nobody was actually, actually came to any harm that we know of as a result of using Haystack, but the potential was there because people at various stages of the chain were irresponsible. You also have to take a people-centered approach. So this kind of ties back to understanding your audience. There's a bit of linkage between some of the principles here. You just really need to put the people in the community that you're trying to assist at the center of what you're doing. Talk to local people, talk to local leaders, let local partners really be the leaders in a lot of cases, because you don't want to be the person that comes in with a solution for a problem that's different from what they actually have, or for a problem that doesn't exist. So think about how your solution fits into their lives. The example image that I have here is not quite from a strictly human rights focused project, but something related, which is a citizen journalism project in India, where people in certain tribal communities have set up a sort of news service that they can access easily in remote areas, even though the only technology that the people living there have access to are very, very basic mobile phones. And what they did was they set up a system whereby people could act as reporters. They could record voice messages through their phone, which others could then come and, by using an access code, access those reports and listen to them on their own phone. And not only does this make sense from a technology perspective, sort of suiting themselves to what the tools were available to the people, but it also makes sense from a cultural perspective, because these are communities that actually had a very strong oral history tradition. And so while it may not have been intuitive or even possible, depending on literacy rates, for them to read written information, for them to simply pick up their phone and dial a code and then hear somebody talking about the latest news was very intuitive and very natural, and people had a greater tendency to trust that as a medium of information. Once again, my favorite point is to link technological tools to real-world action. Don't just facilitate slacktivism with feel-good campaigns or anything like that. Even if you are just trying to build up a social media presence, make sure that you at some point direct those people who have engaged with you online towards some kind of real-world action. It doesn't have to be coming out for a demonstration or something like that. It might be making a donation, getting involved with your cause as a volunteer, or what have you. And lastly, kind of tying into the managing risks point, ensure redundancy, safety, and security. And the thing to take away here with redundancy is that it's very important not just to protect your users and your data and make sure that they're safe and secure, but also the system itself that you're using. So essentially, make sure that you have backups. Whatever technological system that you're having, make it as robust as you can so that if some kind of disruption happens, be it accidental or malicious, because accidents happen, but at the same time, in this kind of line of work, there may be people trying to take you down. You need to have backups for that to make sure that if it goes offline, you can bring it online quickly, or even have a non-digital or a more sort of, have a non-digital backup. And an example there would be Egypt a couple of years ago in the early stages of the Arab Spring, where the protesters were using Facebook and similar tools to organize a lot of their demonstrations. And the government said, all right, well, I guess we'll just turn off the internet. And that's what they did, because they had a switch, essentially, to turn off the internet. And suddenly Egypt had no more internet. So what did the demonstrators do? They got photocopiers and they made posters. Not exactly the most amazing technology, but it worked. That combined with typical grassroots, old-fashioned methods of organizing protests helped them to sort of fill that gap and overcome that disruption and still get people out into the streets taking action. So now it's time for some examples, which I'll run through. In the course, we do actual case studies with different places and different types of technology. Don't have time for that here, but I'm going to run through sort of a miniature version of each one. So to start off, just say a few words about the mobile revolution, which is the sort of colloquial term that's been applied to the really rapid increase in accessibility of mobile phones over the last 5 to 10 years. We're actually, you can see in the graph here that the developed countries, especially especially Western Europe and North America and parts of Asia as well, have started to actually tail off and sort of flatten off in terms of their mobile adoption growth, because we're getting to the point where pretty much everybody has a mobile phone. Places in the developing world, especially sub-Saharan Africa, which has 650 million mobile phone subscribers, are still rapidly growing. And we're actually reaching the point where globally there will be 4 billion actually unique mobile phone users within a couple of years, it's projected. So theoretically, when you take out the very young and the very old, that's the vast majority of the adult population of the world. So we're rapidly reaching the point where we have the potential for anybody to reach out and communicate with anybody else via voice or text, basically instantaneously. And that's very, very significant for human rights activists, people working on other types of social change, people working in governance, development, and health, etc. It's important to understand also that when I talk about the developing world and the mobile revolution, we're not just talking about places like sub-Saharan Africa as being consumers of technology. They're also producers of technology. And there's a level of sort of innovation taking place in places like that people would not necessarily expect if they just went by stereotypes. The World Bank, last I checked, estimates that there are approximately 50 tech incubators and hubs and innovation centers and that sort of thing all around sub-Saharan Africa. So we're actually at a point now where places like Nairobi in Kenya or Lagos, Nigeria, or parts of South Africa are essentially miniature Silicon Valleys. And there are people doing creative things with technology that are never thought of necessarily in Western Europe or North America, because we have access to higher bandwidth, more advanced technologies and that sort of thing. And I'll talk a bit more about that in just a moment. This is also important, I should point out, because although a lot of the development that we see here is on the commercial and entrepreneurial side of things, that does very quickly cascade over into areas like human rights and social change. Because in the same way that the laptops and the internet and other communications technologies that we use now were initially developed for government, commercial, military purposes, and then became available to civilians and activists, the tools being developed by private companies, the new tools being developed by private companies will at the same time indirectly increase the capacity of activists. So when I mentioned 650 million mobile phones in sub-Saharan Africa, we're not necessarily talking about iPhones and Androids and Blackberries. We might be talking, in fact, in a lot of cases, we're talking about things like the Nokia 1100, which is actually the world's most popular phone with 250 million, so 250 million units sold. And it's incredibly basic. All it can do is handle voice, of course, it's a phone, and then very basic text messaging functionality on its little monochrome screen that you have to punch out on an alphanumeric keyboard. The thing is that this is still incredibly powerful compared to the alternative, which is having nothing. And because when you see what I mentioned earlier about innovation and sort of creativity in less developed countries, because there are people who still don't have easy access to the internet in the same way that we do here, they've had to use this more basic technology in ways that we never would have thought of necessarily. There's a whole different dynamic. You could go to various places in Africa and you'll find people using something like a Nokia 1100 and using text messaging in order to promote their businesses. They get spam SMS messages in the same way that we get spam email. People use SMS to search for jobs. There are companies that do the SMS equivalent. SMS, I should mention, is short for short message service, text messaging. There are companies that do the SMS equivalent of online dating. So people find dates by texting with strangers on their phone that they've been matched up with. So there's a whole other kind of dynamic here, which is used for all kinds of different purposes, and it definitely applies to the human rights realm. Sometimes negatively. In 2007 and 8, we saw in Kenya a lot of the violence that took place after the election was actually incited and organized using text messaging, and people using it essentially as a broadcasting tool. Here we tend to think of it as a one-to-one type of communication, but there SMS is often used as a one-to-many tool. So you write a message and then you forward it to your 200 phone contacts, and then they forward it onto their phone contacts, and you get this sort of exponential growth. And if you have influential people starting that chain, it can have very dangerous consequences or very positive consequences, depending on what their aims are. So leading off from SMS, we have crisis mapping, which is a really big sort of aspect of this realm. And this really got its start, it got a big jump start in Kenya in 2007 and 2008 when there was a contested presidential election that, as I mentioned, led to a lot of violence. Afterwards, there were over 1,000 people killed, several 100,000 displaced from their homes, many who still haven't returned home today. And there was a blogger there were a lot of bloggers covering the violence, but there was one in particular who wondered if there was a better way to cover what was happening and to get a grasp on the situation and communicate that to her online followers. And she teamed up with a couple of developers, and what they did was they created a platform called Ushahidi, which is Swahili for witness, I believe. And what Ushahidi is quite simply, as I mentioned earlier, a map where people can submit data as individuals via their phone, via social media, email, web forms, etc., about what the status of their current location is. So you could say, you know, I'm at such and such location. There's a riot taking place right now. I just saw 10 people who were killed. It took place at these times and so on, and then that gets put as a point on the map. And when you have hundreds or thousands of people submitting these little granular bits of data, you can put together an overall big picture from that. And that's very valuable for people not only to understand the situation if they're living in it and then react accordingly, like perhaps avoiding trouble spots, but also outside responders going in. Because outside of the human rights or conflict monitoring realm, Ushahidi has also been adopted a lot for disaster response purposes. One of its biggest deployments was in 2000, not too long, a couple years after 2008 in Haiti, when the big earthquake took place there. And Ushahidi was used by international disaster response crews to get a quicker grasp on the situation than they would have been able to by conventional means of sending in individuals to do surveys. When you have 1,000 members of the population submitting data versus 10 guys spending a week going out and taking notes, you get perhaps a somewhat less reliable, but a much quicker and more holistic picture of the action and can respond more effectively. To give you a visual of what it actually looks like, because you might be curious if you haven't seen it before, this is HarassMap, which is an Ushahidi deployment in Cairo. It's active right now. It's actually funded by the International Development Research Council of Canada, and the objective of HarassMap is to represent the situation in Cairo in terms of sexual harassment, which is a very serious problem there. And a lot of people in Cairo have sort of ignore this problem or have misconceptions about it. And the idea with HarassMap is that when women are harassed or people witness a case of harassment, they can anonymously report it. An overall picture can be put together. And then, and this is the most important part, HarassMap volunteers take actual hard copies of that, of the map, whatever the latest situation, the status of it is, and go out into the community and then liaise with people in the community and show them what their local area is like, what is going on around them, kind of open their eyes about it, and then use this to support programs that essentially try to address sexual harassment issues. So it has that real-world action link instead of just making a map that's up on a website for people to go passively look at. And that's really key. So that's a pretty cool project. Just moving on, I realize that I'm going a little bit over time, so I'll speed this up and we can get to questions or discussions or anything that you guys have. When we talk about moving forward a little bit in time, in 2009 in Iran, there was a contested presidential election once again. These things always seem to cause problems, where the incumbent was not expected to win, but surprisingly or not, he did. And a lot of opposition supporters alleged, probably correctly, that he and his supporters had stolen the election by rigging the results. They took to the streets and said, we're not taking this anymore. So we want democracy in Iran. And the Iranian government, which has never been a big fan of dissent of any sort, cracked down, and they cracked down hard. They brought out their, pretty much the full security apparatus, including the Basij militia, which is this sort of million-man strong army of sort of fundamentalist fanatics who are at the sort of at the beck and call of the country's clerics, and they started attacking demonstrators. Amnesty International estimates that at least 80 people were killed. The actual number is probably higher. Amnesty just has a very high standard for corroborating their data, so they tend to be very conservative with their numbers. But we do know that large numbers of people died, and many more were injured, tortured, imprisoned, and there was also a lot of sexual abuse that took place over the course of several weeks. The government also did what it could to prevent both people within Iran and people in the outside world from knowing about what was happening. So they did their best to censor what was taking place online, and they also did their best to keep the Western, well, the world media, but especially the Western media out. So foreign reporters were not allowed, despite the fact that the Western world, or the world in general, but especially the Western media, was very interested in what was happening in Iran. Fortunately, there was a thing called Twitter, which was relatively new at the time and had been gaining in popularity, and suddenly found itself not so much as a sort of amusing internet oddity, but now actually at the heart of this geopolitical event, and the only real source of information getting out of Iran. So you had these citizen journalists in Iran who were using it, well, there were the demonstrators and the leaders of the protests who were using it as an organizing tool within to get people out onto the streets, and then others who were using it as a way of telling the outside world about what they were seeing there. And Twitter really became the focus of a lot of Western media attention, which is why some people got overly excited and called this the Twitter revolution. Unfortunately, actually, I'll get to the sort of the disadvantages in a moment, but I will just kind of highlight that there was, sorry, these graphs are a little small probably to see on the screen. I won't get into kind of explaining the intricacies of them anyway, but Twitter did have advantages. It was a link, like I said, with the outside world from opposition activists, and also helped people to find opportunities to participate in protests and stay informed about what was happening. It was also relatively easy for activists to conceal their identities, fortunately. And there was an interesting case here of slacktivism having a sort of unintended benefit, which is nice, where people around the world had decided that as a show of solidarity, they would change their Twitter profile to indicate that their location was Tehran, the capital of Iran, regardless of where they actually lived. And so this seems like a relatively meaningless, feel-good thing to do until you realize that it actually made it it made it somewhat more difficult for the censors in Iran to cut down and counter what was being put out by the actual protesters. And it made it harder for them to figure out who these anonymous people online were in the real world and then send the security forces after them. However, there were some downsides. Some argue that Twitter did not play the influential role that some other people argue it does, or did, because the protests were too large and well organized to be this kind of flash mob. That's not necessarily the biggest problem that I would say, because only fairly naive people at the time would have thought that the only reason that demonstrations were happening in Iran was because of Twitter. But the real problem was the sort of outsized influence that it was assigned by Western media and Western governments. It got to the point where it's rumored that the U.S. State Department actually intervened with some scheduled maintenance that the company Twitter was going to do, which would have put the site out of operation for a few hours during the protests. And they supposedly went and requested that this be rescheduled so that Iranians could keep using the service. The thing is, in terms of Iranians that were actually using the service, we may have been a little misled about how many were actually engaged with it. There are downsides to these kinds of tools if we're not careful about understanding who is actually engaging with them and who's on there as users. So I don't have a demographic breakdown of Twitter users in Iran at the time, but I do have one for China around roughly the same time. And one survey I found discovered that of Twitter users at that time in China, 87% were male, 70% were in their 20s. The majority also had at least one degree, lived in large affluent cities, and were students or IT workers. So we have predominantly well-educated, affluent males who live in urban areas and are technically literate. If you were somebody in the outside world, let's say a media outlet, who was using Twitter as your sole source of information on what was happening at that time, do you think that you would be getting necessarily a balanced view? Probably not. So in Iran at the time, like I said, we don't have similar numbers, but the pie chart, which might be a little hard to see, and a lot of the sections of it are very, very tiny, which is actually very illustrative. The pie chart shows us, with the big orange chunk, that at the time of the protests, 93% of Twitter users in Iran lived in Tehran, the capital. So granted, Tehran was the center of activity, but it wasn't certainly by any means the only place in the country where people probably had something to say about the election and the protests that followed it. So the Western media was using this as their primary source for reporting on the situation and probably getting a pretty biased, or at least non-representative view of what was happening. Cell phone cameras, I'll just say a few quick words where cell phone cameras really came into their own here. It was the first time that a major human rights event had ever had large numbers of people with camera-equipped cell phones there on the ground engaged in it. So at the same time that we didn't have the ability for Western, or I keep saying Western, but really international reporters or even Iranian reporters to be on the ground recording what was happening, you could have hundreds or even thousands of people at a protest capturing their own little slice of the action and later uploading it to YouTube to show the world. A couple of years later in Egypt, of course, Facebook and other social media played just as, if not more, of an influential role. This time the claim to fame is a little bit more legitimate than it might have been with Twitter in Iran. But social media isn't necessarily the most interesting and the most unique thing to come out of the early Arab Spring protests there. Although we do see that very large numbers of people in Egypt had at that time internet access and were Facebook users. A very large number of them were also phone or mobile phone subscribers. And what's unique here is that unlike in Iran a couple of years prior, a lot more people had smartphones and a lot more people had data connectivity as well. Some people had smartphones in Iran in 2009, but there was no 3G, so they couldn't actually connect to the internet with them, which is a big handicap and kind of takes away one of the main benefits of a smartphone. People in Egypt didn't have that issue. And because they had smartphones, they could start doing creative things, not just with social media, but with apps. So, for instance, creating the panic button app, Etmasact, where there was a big issue with activists just going missing. They would get arrested one day and nobody would know what had happened to them or where they went. But with Etnosact, they could have a pre-programmed list of trusted contacts. They could hit the big red button if they were about to be arrested or have something else bad happen to them, and their contacts would be notified of their status and their last known location, which greatly improved their odds of being found and assisted in some way. There are other cool examples which I won't get into there, just for lack of time. So just wrapping up, there are a couple of things on the horizon. At the Sentinel Project, we're always looking at this kind of stuff and kind of figuring out what we might be able to use at some point down the road. So satellite imagery is an example of this trend that I like to see, where a lot of technologies that were formerly the preserve of governments and militaries and intelligence agencies and large corporations are becoming more and more accessible to civilians, including activists and people working for social good. So satellite imagery is one of those. We now have commercially available satellite imagery, which, granted, is prohibitively expensive for most individuals and NGOs, but is being used in some areas. So an example is the similarly named, but not the same, satellite Sentinel Project. And they use commercially available satellite imagery from the company Digital Globe to monitor atrocities in South Sudan and to actually monitor military movements and buildups for purposes of documenting major human rights abuses and also warning people that are in harm's way. UAVs, of course, one of my favorite topics, as I mentioned. The surface has only been scratched in terms of the human rights implications, I mean positive human rights implications of UAVs, but there are a couple of examples in Eastern Europe where individuals have used these in order to film protests. So no longer do you have to rely on 100 people throughout the crowds capturing their own grainy, shaky little slice of the action and then putting together a picture from that. You can have your flying robot in the sky get a bird's eye view, as we see here in the image on the right, which I believe comes from a protest in Warsaw, where the police, the Polish police cracked down and responded violently. And lastly, something that you've probably heard of is big data, which is basically the idea, I'm no expert on this, and obviously I'm not going to go into great detail in the next 30 seconds anyway, but the idea here is that with the massive amounts of data that people are producing these days by their online activities and their mobile phone activities and other interactions with technology, we can look at these, millions or billions of little, collections of data points and derive sort of insights from them that can help us to better understand human behavior and potentially even predict things that are going to happen next. So this has massive human rights implications in various ways. To be honest, more so on the negative side in terms of how this could be used to violate human rights. But it does also have potential for pro-human rights people. Let's say you're a pro-democracy organizer somewhere and you want a great way of gauging public sentiment and timing your protest correctly. This might be a useful tool once it becomes more accessible to members of the population in order to do that. The flip side is it's a great way of massively violating the privacy of an entire populace, potentially. And governments might start using it for predictive purposes and actually preemptively cracking down on protests that haven't even happened yet. So there are all kinds of complications here, but it's something that's increasingly part of the landscape and worth being aware of. So that pretty much wraps things up. If you liked what I had to say and you don't hate the sound of my voice enough that you would never want to hear it again, you can take the full course if you want. It's all online, 5 weeks long, only $49. We're sold out for the June session, and the July session, which we expanded, is mostly sold out, but there are some spots left. So if you're interested in it, come talk to me, or go have a look at our website. There's a link on our blog that'll take you there. Like us on Facebook, facebook.com/stopgenocide, twitter.com/Sentinel Project. Follow us. And if you really don't like hate speech and you want to help us keep an eye on that, go register at HateBase, because that's a tool that works more effectively the larger number of people that are on there submitting data to it and helping us to monitor. And if you're really interested in what we do, you're also welcome to volunteer if there's anything about our work that you would like to contribute to.